Welcome again. My name is Chris Lepe, and I'm the Senior Community Planner with Transform. We're the Bay Area's most awesome transportation and land use advocacy organization, in case you didn't know. And so we're working with a variety of different partners to bring this series together. This is our second to last event. Our next one is tomorrow, actually. And it's been great. We've had, somewhere between like 50 to 100 folks show up for each of them. Each of these are being recorded, by the way. So if you would like to share this event after the fact, feel free to share. It's being audio and video recorded. So a couple housekeeping items. First of all, we do have a raffle. So we've got 3 books to be raffled out. It's the book 3 Revolutions by Daniel Sparling, which really covers electrification, automation, and shared vehicle technology, and kind of the combination of those new trends, if you will, and the benefits that it can bring. So stick around for that. And finally, just kind of thanking all of our partners, including Alto Forward, Friends of Caltrain, Samtrans, Lyft. Trying to think about some of the other key ones, but what's that? Samtrans, Lyft, and MTI, yes, Meta Transportation Student. All of our great partners that help to fund this program, as well as to just overall collaborate and make it happen. And yes, the Silicon Valley Climate Action Alliance. So with that, I'll hand it over to Adina, and feel free to take it from here. Thank you.
Okay, great. It is great to see folks. Is this?
It's okay. You won't hear yourself.
Okay. And yeah, this is not a large enough. Everybody can probably hear me anyway. So my name is Adina Levin. I'm with Friends of Caltrain, which is a nonprofit focusing on successful Caltrain modernization in the context of sustainable transportation on the Peninsula Corridor from San Francisco through to San Jose and connections. So for sustainable transportation, this is really a significant motivation as to why we do what we do, and excited to see folks here. So first of all, let me ask, so who here is from Palo Alto? Okay, and then other locations represented, just shout because it's only a few.
Sunnyvale.
Okay.
San Mateo.
Cool. Okay. All right. Cool. And who here has been engaged in climate action plans before today? Who's worked on climate action plans as a community member? Okay, about half of us, maybe a little bit more than half. And who's worked on climate action plans as a professional? Who? Excellent, a few of us. And who is relatively new to climate action plans? Okay, a few of us. Okay, so I think that that's good. And the fact that a good number of us have been involved in this is, I think, telling. If this is new to you, this is fantastic. You will hopefully learn a lot. And if you've been engaged in this for a while, this is something that our area has been really passionate about. So when I moved to the Bay Area in 2006, when I was part of a team that was starting a software company and wanted to get involved in the community, the very first thing I stumbled into is someone said, hey, our city is doing a climate action plan, and do you want to come join? They're having a meeting on such and such a date at the library. And I'm like, okay, great. This is a great way to get involved in the community. And that's how I kind of stumbled into all of this. And that's true for a lot of us. So so getting engaged in doing a climate action plan, taking climate change seriously, and then thinking about the things that our communities can do to affect this. One of the things that's become evident over the last decade or so, both in the state and then in individual communities, is that California as an overall leader has been making progress and on energy, but in transportation, we're pretty much stuck. And that pertains to some of our communities. And so The goal here is to get that big picture, learning about climate action plans, what they are, like why they're done, what goes into them, and then really drill down into that transportation area where we haven't been making as much progress, look at what can be done, look at maybe some of the reasons why we have been stuck, and then brainstorm a little bit about how we might get unstuck in our roles as community members. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have, we'll start off with Professor Billy Riggs at UCSF, who's a professor with a significant background in transportation and climate and public and private sector expertise on transportation. Did I get anything wrong there? All right, I was going by memory and not notes. And Gil Friend, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Palo Alto and has a long and illustrious career in sustainability, really one of the founders in the field. Unfortunately, we will not have Professor Michael Boswell here. He is stuck in Florida. He was too ill to travel here to make this. And so we will be, however, we've got such mighty expertise on our panel that I think that we'll be able to provide a compelling program even though he's not able to join us here. So we'll start off with Billy Riggs to give us an overview on climate action.
Thank you. So I'm Billy Riggs. I'm a professor at University of San Francisco. I know I have some familiar faces here in the audience. I actually had a past life as a professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and before that was the transportation program manager as well as an adjunct faculty member at UC Berkeley. And what Adina and I were talking about before is I actually have a career as a practicing engineer for and planner for the Coast Guard as well as an environmental consultant here in the Bay Area. And I don't know why I look so well preserved. You should have seen me 20 years ago. So I want to just start off kind of, Mike and I were able to eke out a conversation on the phone today and talk about like the framing at the global level and really distill down global to local for us. And some of this may be review for you that have been in the climate field for a while, but really I think this frames what Adina started off talking about and also frames kind of why we're doing what we're doing. So first off, as Al Gore showed us almost 20 years ago now, the inconvenient or hopefully more convenient truth is that the world is getting hotter. George Monbiot wrote a book in the late 90s called Heat, and it was all about this trend about the world getting hotter. We need to reduce that, and basically we're killing ourselves through love miles. And he was one of the first people that really triggered for me the pain that is transportation, the pain point that are non-point sources. And why I want to talk about that, why I want to emphasize that, and he talked about love miles to illustrate people like me who don't come from the West Coast, who come from a flyover state, that to see my loved ones, I have to get in one of these big steel beasts and ride across the country. So, I think that's really something to keep in mind. Transportation, and not just ground transportation, is a big issue, and it's one that we're struggling to crack. So, if we talk about kind of the global context, and these are some stats from the World Health Organization and the World Bank, we have almost 2 billion people, or 6 billion people, but we, have a number of people using the roads, much of which is coming from fossil fuel-based energy, tons of deaths, and globally 23% of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so significant issue. I work a lot at the local and also the campus scale. So I've done about 6 climate action plans for campuses particularly, a couple for local governments, and some campuses we see as much as 55% of emissions being from commute-related emissions. And I point over here because one of my students here was here. Actually, we did the Cal Poly Climate Action Plan together about 3 years ago, and she's a planner in San Carlos now. Sorry, this is Rebecca. You can get a chance to meet her a little later. I apologize. So, at a global scale, and if we look at kind of where we're going, we have these strategies, mitigation, adaptation, but also support for that from a managerial standpoint, both from a capacity ability, technology transfer, all these different frameworks that we can create to support the mitigation and adaptation. And I tend to, these days, work more in that managerial policy-based framework in supporting the granular efforts that many of you will go out and implement. So here's we are into, if we frame this global framework filtering down to kind of our state, our region, yes, we have what do we call, and I've thrown a bunch of acronyms up here. I'm just going to run through them. We have, sustainable growth goals with, and we have basically statewide rules coming down from AB 32, which is our landmark climate bill, SB 375, which is one of the things that has allowed us to start actually looking at some of the land use implications of transportation. And we can dissect some of that. I'll get into kind of what I see as place-based strategies, and I think that's a number of things that Palo Alto Forward has been focusing on. But we also have city and private sector champions that have really focused on this idea of innovation and contributing to what the state of California has started with regard to cap and trade, as well as something that's filtering back to our community, which is the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Community Grant Program, which is actually a direct offspring of your cap and trade sales dollars. And we can talk about that a little more in the Q&A if you'd like. But if we distill down to kind of where we are today in Palo Alto, state of California wants us to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. Palo Alto has what we call an 80-30 goal. Or, so we want an 80% reduction by 2030. So we have a goal in Palo Alto, and I think this is the spirit of this city that we're in right now, of reducing that even more. And I think you'll hear a little more about some of the initiatives that Palo Alto has done this, but all of this global framework, I just want to frame, is to galvanize action. And that's where we are now. And one of the toughest places to galvanize action is in the transportation sector, in the non-point emission sector. And I think you heard some of Adina's frustration. I tend to carry a spirit of optimism and perhaps a little too much optimism sometimes. But I do think we have made some strides in this area. We are doing really well in our electrification efforts. And I just wanted to show in California's scoping plan last year, 2017, these two graphs appeared. And what this does, it shows the dramatic increase. And I'll just point to, I guess I can't point on a plasma projector, but if you look at just the trajectory of sustainable energy sources that we've been able to make statewide over the last 5 years, it's astronomical. We're dramatically producing more sustainable energy, and we're also just churning out more and more electric or carbon-less zero-emission vehicles. So, I mean, we are making strides in that electrification field, and I think that we're also, Dan Sterling and some other colleagues, Giovanni Tricelli, Nico Larco, a number of my colleagues and I have really been working on some of these innovation areas. I like to show this picture because this is very controversial by my office right now. This idea of the scooter. So we have the scooter wars of 2018, and of course it was the dockless bike share wars of 2017. But the point is this is nudging us to zero-emission commuting. And despite the fact that many planners in the room, I know you don't like the aesthetics of this, and we worry about the impacts of our pedestrians. We ain't Manhattan. Let me just frame that. So to a certain degree, I'm expressing my own bias, which is a bias that does nudge us towards sustainable commuting and even carless commuting, place-based strategies. But also, these are really low emitting strategies. So to a certain degree, should should San Francisco be pushing back on the scooter wars of 2018 so much? Question? We can maybe talk about that. Maybe you can try to get me to elicit more of an opinion later. But I want to frame things by this. So my worldview and my research is really focused on two parallel areas: the built environment and behavior. And I know we have some people involved with TDM, or transportation demand management, nudging people in terms of behaving in different ways. That's been my core research for a while. And so I want to talk about some of those some of that framework and how it frames the global to the local, and how we get move towards more sustainable travel behavior in this new mobility future that we're in. And I think it starts, again, with the land use strategy. This is a diagram that uses a model based on Kevin Lynch, who talked about the idea of pathways and nodes and edges. And one of my students did this. And I think it was really interesting for me to look at this is because what it did was it actually emphasized some employment sectors, but it also felt really devoid of some rail networks and some investment. And I think that we may hear a little bit more about that from some of our speakers. But you know,
that was really interesting, and I do not understand what that's about at all. Can you say what that's
so,
trying to do in 1 minute?
So this is actually trying to we're trying to classify, and this is just the idea of regional classification of generalized use. So the idea of matching employment and housing on a regional scale. And so this idea is thinking about regional clustering at a meso scale, so at a medium scale as opposed to a macro scale, and thinking about the relationship. So what we can infer from this, and I'll divulge one of the next slides, and some hypothesis my student kept, and this is way before some of the recent dialogue. One of my students was really interested in this, and he's like, well, why is there all this blue housing on this east side of the Bay Area, and why is there all this, you know, mixed employment and employment, the red and the green, on this side? We have some issues here, and our issues are they span city boundaries. And so we see this a lot when we talk about jobs to housing balance. But you know, my perspective is, hey, jobs to housing balance, you know, I'll throw in some colloquial Kentuckyisms. That ain't a city issue, right? That's a regional issue. And you know, one of the things they did before, you know, this idea of Dumbarton Rail became a little more prominent, the idea that this Dumbarton corridor could be really important. Oh, wait a minute, we have all that blue and we have all this employment, and so I guess that Facebook was still cool back then when they were doing this work, and they were like, well, we have this Ravenswood specific plan area. Maybe that actually is an opportunity for TOD and housing that's coupled with rail investments, and you have an opportunity for location efficiency and car-free light development. Sorry, transportation-oriented development, TOD. And so, you know, this is just a student project. It was notional in nature. They were throwing out ideas, but for me, what it does is it opens up opportunity, and it opens up visions that maybe extend beyond the limitations that we have, whether or not they're budgetary, or whether or not they're political, or whether or not they're jurisdictional. And some of the stuff that they were throwing out were these paseos that actually, and these streets that are near impossible if we look at our current street engineering standards. And I think that's a good jumping off point, because we have an issue statewide where transit-oriented development has been opposed by some of our greenest organizations. And I just think it's important to emphasize what has been cast as a little bit of a paradox in our state, where we had this bill 827 recently, where, you know, the Sierra Club was one of the strongest opponents to that, as opposed to proponent. And we can dialogue that a little, neighbor. So I want to talk about three kind of strategies I see that connect even further down to the local level. If we extend beyond the regional and we extend to these municipalities, we've done a lot of work in thinking about, okay, well, if you're going to operationalize these goals, if you have things in your climate action plan that you want to do, let's figure out how to do them. And one of the things you can do is connect them to finance. And a student and I a couple years ago went through every community in the country, in the US, that had a bicycle-friendly rating as well as a walkable-friendly rating. And those are by the League of American Bicyclists, and the Pedestrian Safety and Information Center does those ratings. And what we found is there's 36 cities that meet both of those classifications in the US. Actually fairly small, right? That are both bikeable and walkable based on quantifiable standards. And of those cities, we looked at 12 of them as case studies. And we just want to understand, well, how are they getting stuff done? How are they doing stuff? And overwhelmingly, many of them are looking at sales tax auctions, but they're also looking at specific allocations based on modal priorities. And why this is interesting is because we've seen this emergence in California general planning process, where we have a couple cities in California that have said, as a part of our general plan, as a part of our circulation element, we're going to commit to these aspirational modal goals. And I was involved as a part of the San Luis Obispo LUCE, the land use and circulation element. They did land use and circulation at the same time. In that they actually tried to target a modal goal, a transportation share, a percentage of the transportation market that is very aggressive. They wanted, for example, 20% bicycle share. But the interesting thing about that is that beyond aspiration, they said, and we're going to commit 20% of our capital improvement budget to bicycles. Now, that's one of the few cities that has been bold enough to do that, and I think we have to question why. You know why? So connecting to finance, can we do that? Can we enhance market incentives? And this is where I love to play, because I think if we're talking about connecting to finance, maybe we should be financing sustainable behaviors. And we can look at two different types of incentives. And in our traditional transportation management playbook, our traditional method of encouraging people to maybe get out of their car and bike or walk, we've usually focused on these fiscal incentives. Parking, which in some cities that all of us inhabit, we could probably do a better job of pricing parking. Let's not go there. Other places, though, we can actually look at social programs, creating community. For example, UCLA rolled out a year and a half ago an Earn a Bike program. Now, it is kind of a financial goal. It does have value, but it is literally a gift. It is literally, you are gifted a bicycle as a student if you don't bring your car to campus. We can talk a little more about this program if you'd like, but it's a really interesting opportunity. And why? Because there's no such thing as free parking. And I throw this up there because in many markets, parking is dramatically underpriced. So here we have 7 campuses on the West Coast. And I like to look at campuses because they're microcosms of cities. Most university campuses are basically like little Game of Thrones kingdoms. And if we look across the board, I want you to look at the blue only. The effective daily rate for parking on most campuses is between $2 and $7. Our neighbor here at Stanford, although you can get what they call a scratch-off for $13 a day, the effective daily rate of a permit at Stanford, as great as they are, is $4.15, assuming a 20-day work month. All right? Is that a market rate? So can we pull on that fiscal lever? Can we encourage our employers to pull on that fiscal lever more? My old campus, Cal Poly, anybody read this? 90 cents a day. And CSUs are very interesting animals, is because based on the union contract, we can't adjust that. And again, that's something that we as citizens should really think about, because that's something that we can weigh in on. Hey, that's not a fair price for that resource. There are climate impacts on that resource. Why is UCSB so high? I need to take UCSB off here, because I said this is an anomaly in the data because it's a supply issue. In that the data is artificially, basically the percentage is based on spaces, number of spaces, and they're basically looking at reducing, pricing it based on the lack of supply. So it defeats the point, but it actually shows they actually have a really high mode split. Or sorry, they have a really high number of people that do not drive to campus at UCSB. They actually have a very high, does anybody know what they have? What do they have? They have lanes for skateboarding. They have skateboard lanes at UCSB. Yeah. But you know, so I think those are financial levers, but we also have this idea of, and I say, creating a culture and creating a place where it's more about it's more than just about money. It's about doing what's right, aligning yourself with your community and your people. And this is where I've done a lot of experimentation about just providing people, for example, better information, better route. You know, we had a student that actually just was really into, can we get better information for women finding Class 1 bikeways? Number one impediment to women is they do not want to be in a shared lane. What we call Class 3 bikeways, if we look at the literature, are not comfortable to female cyclists. And I think that's something that we should think about. We should actually have guides to cycling. We should create a culture not only of health, but of sustainable travel. And then finally, I operate in this era, and I fortunately have a student who's in the room as well, who's worked with me a lot in this idea of, can we harness data to actually do better planning, but also to do better encouragement? And so this is, I quickly did a map last night of, in about 5 minutes, using a Mapbox program of people that used Bay Area bike networks. And so this is data from Motivate, which is the company that actually manages the Bay Area bike share network. And see, this is basically a month of use. And you can see that there's a lot of use, and it's by actually a significant, I cross-tabbed it with something else, so it's a significant amount of people using it in Oakland as well as San Francisco. This was one of the first rollouts. But we also have this kind of new mobility future. And I think if you came to one of our events, one of the events that Transform hosted a couple months ago, we do have this idea that Uber and Lyft are reshaping the data landscape and the travel landscape. We don't know a lot about how those trips are impacting our environment. But are they tools? Are they opportunities? And I actually think that I have a pretty positive approach with this. I think that with appropriate planning, we can achieve cities. And one of the things that I actually really focus on with my lab at University of San Francisco now is using some digital tools that we're continuing to evolve to use data from people like you. And this is our tool, our REE Street tool, where we can actually give people visions of the street and we can get their feedback. So we actually give them a tablet. We ask them, hey, play with the street. Tell us what you think. And we capture that. But we capture it not from just one person. We capture it from hundreds, if not thousands of people. So about 3 months ago, we put out this street, and we actually did this a little differently. We didn't do it in an event. We did it online. And we got about 8,000 people that told us what vision they wanted for this in a future where there were autonomous vehicles, and autonomous vehicles were a certain part of the mix. And by and large, people told us what? What do you think they told us? They told us that is way too many lanes. And so people want road diets. They want to see fewer cars on the road. But the problem is that bicycles are like bunnies and parking is super painful. And the problem is, so when we get to the street like this, which is an aggregate street that represents kind of what their vision was, is that we forget about the pain that this causes. And if we forget about the incremental steps. But if we can actually create tools that maybe we can envision that and we can talk about what the impacts will be, then I think that's a real opportunity to not only harness the power of technology, but to really change what I see as the climate future as well. So I would say, it sounds like there's some questions, but I'm very action-oriented, and I put 2 recent projects from Menlo Park and Palo Alto up here that are paradoxical in nature. Should we be building more parking? And these are both kind of a little bit, we should question these. And to that extent, it's time to act. It's time to really, are these consistent with our place-based strategies? Do they connect with are we connecting our financial goals with our planning goals? Are we actually harnessing market incentives to prevent parking behavior? And are we actually looking at how we can harness data to reinvent the street? And so with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Adina, and she can provide some connecting.
Yes, I'll do a little bit of a transition from Billy into Gil. And
so I'm sorry, was a couple of hands up. May I take a question while you're doing that, or?
I think we got this, and I would like to take questions at the end because I really want to have a lot of time for good. Back and forth, and before I head up to the top of this 2-minute transition here, Billy mentioned.
Adina, would you mind speaking into the mic for the video people?
Okay.
I can move this over.
Okay. So Billy mentioned a Class 3 bicycle facility. Is there anybody who would welcome that being defined? Okay, great. That is, that's a sharrow. So if you've ever seen, arrow-looking paint on the roadway, and like, first of all, if you don't know what that is, plenty of people actually don't know what that is, but that's a shared use marking, and that means that someone who's using a bicycle can be expected to bike in the middle of that street, just like a vehicle would be expected to drive on that street. And that is a facility that has been proven, can be useful on some slow streets, but on larger streets is not that safe, and people do not feel that comfortable with them. So just wanted to make sure everybody. Gil is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Palo Alto, and he's going to be drilling into Palo Alto in just a second. But one of the things that I want to emphasize here, which is something that came up in our prep call, is to make it clear that we are not just talking about Palo Alto. We're not picking, certainly, on any one city, because what we're talking about here is something that is really kind of ubiquitous and common in the region. Billy had shown in California as a whole, where we're making progress on greenhouse gas emissions overall, which is really fantastic. But that orange on the bottom is transportation, and that has not made progress on the state overall. We see the same pattern in Palo Alto, great progress on overall climate emissions, especially since Palo Alto has a utility, but pretty much flat on transportation. Mountain View, this is something that was published to the City Council on April 25th. They didn't have a chart, but the same thing. The largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, as in California as a whole and the other cities, 60% are transportation, and the emissions from energy have decreased over the last decade by 15%, water and waste down 38%, which is great. We're making progress on these other sectors, but those could not keep pace with the rising transportation emissions that increased by 22%. So progress on other sectors, less so on transportation. Similarly, Sunnyvale, here's their overview. Transportation is the largest set of greenhouse gas emissions, and similarly, they are, similar pattern, not making as much progress on transportation. And a variety of our cities, including Mountain View, including Sunnyvale, are updating climate action plans now. And the issues that cities and counties and at the regional level have control of are making decisions on an ongoing basis, such as a San Mateo County transportation ballot measure with important decisions coming up, just in the next couple of months. So this is a really live issue that we have a chance to get involved with as citizens, whether we're in Palo Alto or the other cities that this is playing out. And so with that, I will turn this over to Gil.
Thanks, Adina. Let's see how we find the other guy here. Good. Too small to see. Nope. Slideshow. New slideshow. There we go.
You got it?
Maybe. Where's my?
You're not getting presented these. So.
Yeah. I had it a moment ago. Ah.
Is that working? Yeah.
Now we're there. Okay, good. All right. Thank you for that. Thanks, Billy and Adina. Welcome, everybody. So I'm Gil Friend. I'm Chief Sustainability for the City of Palo Alto. Welcome to Palo Alto, those of you who are visiting. I've been living for the past 40 6 years out of a commitment to a world that works for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. And some of you will recognize that as the philosophy of Buckminster Fuller. This commitment was formed in a month-long design charrette fresh out of college where we did a deep dive in what does it take to have that happen in energy, water, transportation, housing, healthcare, education, and other domains of human concern. And it was very clear from a deep dive into the data and the analysis that this is feasible, that it's not a matter of technical impossibility, it's a question of human will. And I learned that as a grounded assessment in my bones as a kid of 23, and that set my course ever since then. So I just offer that as a background to how I approach this work. Big vision, grounded in the data, aspirational and practical both together. I'm also a fundamentalist, and I'll confess that with you here, because I believe that fundamentals actually matter, that the physics of things actually matters. And let me share with you a tweet that I saw this afternoon that's really relevant to this conversation. San Francisco wants to add 40,000 new jobs in the South of Market area, and it wants to add 9,800 housing units in the South of Market area. Do the math. How are those other 30,000 people going to do this? California is adding population at 10 times the rate that it's adding housing. So if you wonder about the housing crisis in the Bay Area and you wonder about the transportation crisis in the Bay Area, there you are. There's no escaping those numbers, and any policy that attempts to deal with these issues without dealing with those numbers is going to fail. So that said, the question that I've been asking in the 4.5 years that I've been leading sustainability at Palo Alto is, what can one small city do to advance the sustainability revolution? As Billy said, I'm not going to impersonate the Kentucky. This is not a city issue, it's a regional issue. There are certain things that we do as ourselves. Adina showed the chart of the impressive gains that we've made on reducing emissions. We have a commitment to reduce emissions by 80% by 2030. We're at 45% already. And big gains in electricity, carbon neutral, big gains in natural gas, carbon neutral by offsets on the road to reducing through efficiency and electrification our actual natural gas emissions. But transportation, as Adina pointed out, is pretty flat. Maybe flat, the data is bad. We're dealing with regional data, it's the best we can get, but roughly flat, roughly 72% of our remaining emissions is from road travel. People coming into Palo Alto, people driving out of Palo Alto, and people driving around in town. We think about 80% of that is inbound commuting. Why do we think that? Population here is about 66 or 67,000 people at night. The population in the daytime is about 154,000 people. Net increase of about 88,000 people every day, most of them driving alone, most of them driving in internal combustion powered vehicles. There's the problem. So I'm also a fundamentalist because I think the questions that we ask really matter, and we are asking the wrong questions. The questions that we typically ask around transportation is, how do we provide enough capacity to solve our congestion problems? So we build more roads and the roads fill up. And we build more roads and the roads fill up, and we build more roads and the roads fill up. And how do we provide enough parking capacity to meet our parking needs? Same deal. And I would suggest that that's fundamentally the wrong question, and a much more powerful question is, how do we make it more convenient for anybody, anywhere, at any time to not have to get, where's my slide? My slide's missing, sorry. I'll come to that in a moment. So I've gotten ahead of myself here. So wrong questions, big costs of the personal automobile, okay? You have direct costs of $1 trillion a year in the United States, indirect costs of $2 trillion a year. Nobody sees that. When you buy a car, you don't see that. When you buy a gallon of gas, you don't see that, but we all pay for that in some way. So, better question, I suggest, is this. How can we make it more convenient to not have to drive? So to Billy's point about financial incentives and behavioral incentives, I think this is another kind of one. People will do what is easier, they will not do what's hard. If you give them more money, they will still not do what's hard. If you give them social support, they will still not do what's hard. So there's the challenge of how do we make it easier to not drive in a world, and particularly in a state and a region that is designed around the automobile. I don't have the slides with me. Steve Rainey provided them to me a couple of years ago. If you look at the land use maps of the Bay Area, most of our workplaces are aligned along the highways. They're not aligned along rail. We have rail, but it's a schlep, to use a technical Kentucky term, to get from the rail lines to the workplaces. Palo Alto, as many of you know, has a municipal service center down in the Baylands. We have people who live there, who work there, who would love to commute by public transportation to work. They can't do it because they can't easily get from Caltrain to the service center. So first and last mile becomes a critical issue and a part of this mix. There are big savings possible from a better strategy. This is from Rocky Mountain Institute, estimating $1 trillion and a gigaton of emissions through a combination of strategies. Do we have a button here? Including mobility as a service, moving from car ownership to car service. Uber and Lyft are an example of that. Think about it. You're probably, if you own a home and you own a car, your car is probably your second largest asset. If you're an average American, your second largest asset sits idle about 95% of the time. If we want to think about this as capitalists, that's really bad capital utilization. Why would you tie up your assets in an unproductive way when, you can have a car like this with apps on this that get me what I need of the right mode at the right time when I need it without locking up my capital in something that just sits there all the time. So big economic as well as ecological impacts here. So we think about as mobility of the future is a different kind of approach that says, let's think about mobility as a service, not as an asset, number one. Let's think about mobility-friendly cities that are designed to be walkable and bikeable and pedestrian-friendly through transit-oriented development, how we configure streets, many of the measures that a lot of you have talked about before. Think about the right vehicle for the job, not the right vehicle for your life, because your life includes many different needs. And if you go to Tahoe twice a year, do you really need a four-wheel drive SUV all the time? Or do you need to rent one for a weekend when you need it and maybe live on a bike or a scooter or a small car the rest of the time? And self-driving vehicles, autonomous vehicles as we're calling them now, are another part of the mix. What's not on this list is connected vehicles. Autonomous vehicles connected to traffic flow, connected to traffic signals, so that we start to optimize all the pieces of the system. We see little beginnings of that now with things like Waze and so forth. And you can imagine a mobility ecosystem that has a specification set kind of like this. It needs to be frequent because people find waiting is inconvenient. If you run a shuttle system as Palo Alto does with 15 to 30-minute headways, people aren't going to use it. If you run it at 7-minute or 5-minute headways, I was just in Vienna last month, the subway system is at 3-minute intervals throughout the day. So you don't need a schedule. You just walk onto a platform, there's a train there. If you miss it, 2 minutes later, there's another train there. Simple and convenient. So frequent needs to be responsive. To again take the examples of shuttles, we have 4 shuttle routes going cross town in Palo Alto. Helsinki's been pioneering a dynamic responsive shuttle. Imagine crossing a shuttle with a Lyft or Uber. So the shuttle's got a route, like Chariot does in San Francisco, but if you ping it with your phone, it deviates from the route. If several people ping it deviates even further. So it's able to adapt its route to where the people are and where the need is real time at any moment. Convenient, frequent, accessible, electric because of course. Internal combustion engines are over. Tony Seba at Stanford projects that by 2030, we'll see 80% fewer cars in the United States, none of them internal combustion powered. Norway, England, India, and other countries are banning ICEs in the coming years. So you'll see that big change. And as you may not know, but the state of California is basically saying the policy is efficiency, renewables, and electrification as the core of the energy strategy. So watch, you'll see more and more of that to come. Dynamic is part of the responsive, meeting the needs of the moment in real time as they change. Open and interoperating is really key. The systems need to work together even if they're being provided by different companies. And this is a big challenge because Uber and Lyft, for example, will say our data is ours and it's proprietary and it's key to our business advantage and we don't want to share it. But for the system to work some of that data needs to be shared. And so I've been predicting for the past few years, and we're now starting to see it in the last few months, cities saying to the transit networking companies, a condition of your license to operate is to open certain data into the transportation ecosystem. If you choose not to open your data, that's your choice, but you don't get to roll your wheels in our city. And we'll start seeing, I think, more and more of those kind of deals. And finally, multimodal, because we have varied lives that have varied needs, and sometimes I need a car, and sometimes I need a bike, and sometimes I need to walk, and sometimes I need a truck. And I want a system that gives me, in a single app, like we envision here, access to every single mode of transportation, all the schedules, all the pricing systems, that lets me plan and book and ride and pay, and if I'm doing a commute benefits program, report into my benefits program in a single app, seamless, so I can go door to door anywhere, whether it's from Palo Alto to Berkeley or Palo Alto to Tokyo, through a single coordinated transportation system. There's no reason why we can't do that. The Finns are furthest ahead on this. If you look up mas.global, you'll see an instance of that kind of system operating in Finland, now rolling out into England, and we'll hope to get something like that here in the Bay. To people who say, well, this is lovely but fanciful and pie in the sky, it can't happen, and it certainly can't happen fast. If you look at what we call the diffusion curves of how quickly technologies get adopted, you'll see something about this chart, which is that the lines get steeper and steeper and steeper as you go to the right. Things that took 20 or 30 years to percolate through society when we were young are now taking a couple of years. These things, again, I keep going back to this prop, this didn't exist 11 years ago. There's now, what, 4 billion of them on the planet? This is not just a rich person's toy anymore. These are pervasive. These make a difference for subsistence farmers in Africa. Look at how fast that's moved and how fast things can move. Classic Silicon Valley example. These are memory chips or memory arrays. That was a 5 megabyte array being loaded onto a Pan Am airliner. Remember Pan Am? In 1956. That's a 120 megabyte array. So what, somebody do the math for me, 25 times larger. The next one is 128 gigabytes, 1,000 times larger. Boom. And this is 2014. You know what that looks like now. It's bigger, and it's smaller, and it's cheaper. Tony Seba at Stanford has a book called Clean Disruption. I encourage you to take a look at it. He's got a stack of curves like this that look at the rapid change in price performance curves, in this case of lithium-ion batteries, plummeting, and we know this in the world around us. This one is for electric vehicles, plummeting, the same curve for photovoltaics, the same curve for sensor technologies, the same curve for a host of technologies, rapid decline in price, and that's one of the reasons that the EV penetration projections that Billy showed before keep getting ratcheted upward, because the planners don't understand these disruptive trends, and they're planning based on what has happened in the past, not on what's about to happen in the future. And so if you look at this, this sort of models the secret plan for Tesla that Elon Musk published, I think, a dozen years ago, where he said, we're going to start with a very expensive high-end roadster, $125,000, and then at a certain date, we're going to have a $76,000 luxury sedan, which blew away that market. And then we will have an SUV, and then we will have a high-priced regular sedan like the Model 3 that's just come out. And granted, it has production issues, but there it is. And coming in the next couple of years is a $22,000 entry-level sedan. That was the secret plan. He published the secret plan. And he's just been moving down this learning curve pretty much on schedule. And what this says to you is that there is no way at this point, there's no way that internal combustion vehicles survive. Because the only way they survive now is that the first costs of electrics are high, although the operating costs are low. Once the first cost difference is gone, game over. Can we do this? Yeah, we think we can do this because we've done this before. This is the California electrical efficiency map. In the early 1970s, we made a set of policy moves to emphasize energy efficiency in California policy. The blue line is the per capita electricity consumption in the United States. You see that it's doubled over the last 40 years. The red line is California. You see that it has stayed flat over the last 40 years. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that's because we're suffering in the dark. You know, not having adequate air conditioning, not having cool plasma screens and phones and so forth. We're doing just fine, but we made decisions that changed the game in the market that enabled these to happen and happen quickly. So some of the things that we are enacting or working on or thinking of enacting in Palo Alto, you can see here, I'm not going to read the slides to you, but the basic goals, which is where the thing starts, is to reduce congestion, reduce emissions, and increase convenience. And if you start with that as a kind of a design brief, then the other things follow. Expand non-mobility options, expand transit, create the right incentives, and connect land use and mobility. And this is a really key challenge because the way that we do policy in most of our organizations is siloed. The transportation conversation is in one place and the housing conversation is another place. We actually had a city council meeting in the midst of our comprehensive plan process 2 years ago. Agenda item was housing. Someone started to talk about the relationship of housing and transportation and how housing induces transportation demand and so forth. And one of the council members actually said, Sandra, I think you were there that night, said, I'm sorry, this week we're talking about housing, we'll talk about transportation next week. I wanted to beat my head against the wall. Because I knew that next week when we were talking about transportation, if someone tried to talk about the relationship with housing, that council member would have said, sorry, we talked about that last week. But you can't do this without nexus and locus. Nexus is the interconnection of these issues. You've heard people talk about the energy-water nexus or the energy-water-food nexus. This is the transportation-housing nexus. You cannot solve these problems separately, but we don't have the policy vehicles for doing them together. And the locus issue is where do these decisions happen? And I think Billy mentioned this before, that here in the Bay Area, we've got, 9 counties, 105 or 110 cities, and depending on who you talk to, something like 39 different transportation agencies. Maybe 29, maybe 49. Where do the decisions, how many? 28. 28, okay. A lot. Where do the decisions live? How do we make coordinated decisions? How do we get agreement, which is hard enough with 9 city council members? How do we get coordinated agreement across 28 agencies in a region? And that's one of the challenges that we have to find an answer to. From our perspective, there are sort of 3 core moves that characterize all of our sustainability initiatives. This is like the reduce, reuse, recycle that we're all very familiar with. It starts with reduce, which is to drive down resource use through efficiency. That's one. Second is to shift things, to move from one technology to other. Electrification is shifting us from natural gas to electricity, shifting from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles, from using potable water to flush toilets, which our grandchildren will think we were absolutely insane to be doing something like that, to using recycled water for that, matching the quality to the need, laundry to landscape and so forth. And then there are the more systemic transformational shifts of moving from car ownership to mobility as a service, a fundamental systems change, embedding sustainability into the operations of government and business. So you take into account the sustainability impacts and the carbon impacts before you make decisions in the planning efforts. Aligning incentives. Again, I'll reference what Billy said. Palo Alto has had a commitment since the 1998 comp plan to reduce the dependence on the private automobile. And yet we are one of a number of cities that provides free parking. It's a somewhat disconnected message. It's politically a very complicated message. People have very strong feelings about this. There are real pressing needs today in terms of things like parking capacity that people want solved. Other people see a different way to solve them, and this is politically very contentious and again, hard to find the locus to engage it. But this is the trajectory that we need to move through to address these issues. So when we ask what might be possible, which I suggest is a very useful question to ask, not like what I'm absolutely sure of, but what might be possible here? What could we think of? Could we be a city that survives on ambient resources, the sunlight and rain and wind that pass through our borders? Could we be a car-free city? It seems like a distant goalpost, but Helsinki has already made that declaration. Hamburg has already made that declaration. Cities are moving on this around the world. Cost effectiveness is essential, but our tools are flawed. They don't take into account whole system costs. They force us to sub-optimize our decisions for short-term benefit. How do we design not just better pieces of things, but better systems, which again, we're not set up to do, but that's where the solutions lie. And fundamentally, what can we all do as citizens, as voters, as business people, as neighbors, because that's where the drive for this will actually come from. Ron Dellums, former congressman from Berkeley, Oakland, used to say that Washington is not filled with leaders, it's filled with mirrors. It's people who will reflect what they get from us, so we need to do that. And let me just close with this. This is my latest favorite quote from Adrian Brown, who I heard her on the radio, and she said, "All organizing is science fiction." I thought, what are you talking about? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. But then she went on to unfold it. And it's deeply spiritual because we have faith that we can build a world that we've never experienced. That's what we're all trying to do. And that's the big challenge. So we have to invite people to step into something that they've never seen and never felt and never tasted, and yet have to be willing to step into that to create it, because that's the only way that we can. Thank you.
Inspirational person
even better
to
yeah.
Inspire us. And I've actually got a couple of questions from the speakers based on what they've said, but we've been talking a lot, so I really want to hear from folks here if you have any questions at this point. Yeah.
I have a question. So we in this room are, I'm sure, very inspired and in agreement about this. Spreading this out. It seems like there's a role for, certainly social media, but also entertainment. It would be so great to find a medium to spread this word that will appeal to everyone. That'll reach everyone all around the country and the world. What's going on in that space?
Nothing appeals to everyone. So it's all of the above. It's all those modes in different places. It's the ones that you're most comfortable with, the ones that you like to do. It's social media, traditional media, political media, talking to council members and electeds, knocking on doors, talking with your neighbors. Sandra Slater in the back. Sandra, raise your hand for folks who don't know you. Is the local organizer for a thing called Cool Block, which brings people together on a neighborhood basis to work collaboratively on sustainability improvements. Faith organizations, workplaces. The key is talking with people. And actually, the key, even more than talking with people, I think, is listening to people. Hearing what people are concerned about, because that's ultimately where the connect is. We have different political stances and different ideas about what should be done, but when you get down to it, most people care about pretty much the same things. And so finding the ways to have those conversations and surface common interest, I think, is a really important part of the puzzle. I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Well, I'll just say, I've had the pleasure or pain of sitting on 2 California planning commissions.
My sympathies.
Now currently sitting on Palo Alto Planning and Transportation Commission. Yeah. And I really want to echo the listening piece. I think it's really easy not to empathize right now. But I believe, and we can say that's a national trend. Mm-hmm. And I think to a certain degree, empathy is where we found common ground to solve some of these issues, not only at the local level, but the global level. So I would say finding it in yourself to put yourself in someone else's shoes is probably one of the biggest and the clearest places to start. But then also seeing if there's ways that we can nudge the needle that are consistent with another worldview that's not like ours.
If I put myself in the shoes.
Who's got the mic?
Oh, sorry. We got a thing. We got a thing going on here. My bad.
I want to get back to the issue of the housing jobs balance.
Yeah.
You ended on that. And I think one of the reasons that Scott Wiener had put forth SB 827 was his frustration at many municipalities that basically between the neighbors and the city councils and the planning commissions and planning departments put roadblocks up for new housing. People decide, oh, it overburns the schools, it creates more traffic, which we all know in this room is probably the opposite. But that's perception. And then they would even block transportation projects, like high-speed rail I heard is blocked through Menlo Park in Palo Alto and Atherton. And there's a degree of, I think, unfortunate selfishness, and then people in these communities around in the very wealthy areas where all the jobs are. They don't, this feeling that they don't care about the people that that are forced to commute from the East Bay where the housing is cheaper and sit on the Dumbarton Bridge for 1 hour not, moving, or moving at walking speed. So what is the solution, I think, moving forward from 827, which, I think got defeated because everybody was so afraid about losing local control?
Well, I think fear is an important part of that. I don't know that it's that people don't care about other people. I don't know what's in anybody else's heart. I won't make a judgment about that. But I think people are afraid of losing things that they care about. And everybody is in different ways. And that's why the listening part is so important. Bill Reed, a former partner of mine, is an architect, one of the founders of the LEED building rating system, who doesn't do that anymore. He spends his time working with communities. Tells a story about being brought into a town in the northeast of the United States where a beloved private school was wanting to expand. And it was wanting to expand in a completely eco-groovy way. And it ran into the wall of NIMBY. And by the time Bill was brought in, this community was lawyering up. Neighbors were enraged at each other, and they were prepared to go into 7 years of litigation with each other. And Bill came in and proposed, and for some reason they accepted, he proposed getting all the stakeholders in a room together. So, the school administrators and the teachers and the students and the parents of the students and the designers of the expansion and the contractors and the zoning officials and, just on down the list, everybody, and got them in a room together and locked the door. And he went around and said, what's your position on this? And you said, I think it's great, we should do it. And what's your position? I think this is terrible, I hate it. And he went around the whole room and everybody stated their position. And it was exactly as you'd expect, and you could feel the blood starting to rise. Then he went around again and said, why is that your position? And you'd give your reason, and you'd give your reason. And he went around again, what's the reason behind your reason? And some of you who know manufacturing and the Toyota Total Quality Management System know that the 5 whys is part of what Toyota used to drive remarkable process improvement. They kept going around and around and around until, lo and behold, everybody was saying the same thing. Everybody was expressing the same concerns about the well-being of the children, the quality of life of the community, the safety on the roads, the environmental impact. And Bill stopped and let people just kind of listen to themselves for a moment and said, okay, now let's start the design process. And what they wound up with, remember already this was an eco-groovy design. They did something that was 60% more energy efficient than what they had already done, 30% more water efficient. But the killer was that they got a zoning variance in 2 months from a county that hadn't given a zoning variance in 10 years. And they didn't lawyer up, and they didn't go to war with each other. Now, I don't know if that's going to work everywhere, but I know that he's pulled that off in 6 cities around the world with that basic approach of looking for what we agree on rather than what we disagree on.
Let me just add that I think, I'll put as simple analogies and then I'll go into kind of more theory, is we sometimes try to go for the home run for things we believe in, and we forget that most policy is what Charles Lindblom, a famous political theorist, called incremental. And he called policy making the science of muddling through. And you make the best decision you can at any given time with the given facts and your political will that you can muster at that point in time. And to a certain degree, I think that we can still harness a lot of gains with that incremental and tactical approach. My personal view on what happened with the recent policy that was not successful was that it was somewhat bold, perhaps shock and awe type strategy to just get it done, get it through. It's an emergency. That perhaps it wasn't more of an incremental partnership and collaboration building activity, and to where there wasn't that capacity to achieve it together. And so a certain degree, I do think like just looking at those incremental wins that you can make, the small victories, maybe the first strategy. And if we distill it down from the state level down to the city like Sunnyvale or Palo Alto, Menlo Park or Mountain View, I think it involves what planners call tactical urbanism, and it involves, can we do, small little demonstration projects and wins, like the fact that Palo Alto has an ADU ordinance. Sorry, oh my gosh, I just let acronyms drip from my lips. Yeah, I started. So you start throwing some military ones in there and really, booyah. I think that the for accessory dwelling unit or micro unit or in-law unit policies are one just small thing we can do. And one of the things that I've thrown out for a while is maybe we should start looking at other public right-of-way, for example, for housing or micro units or different types of mobile tumbleweed home strategies. And maybe that is something that we could say, well, you know what, we own this property as a city, and we can do something to address some of this. And then I think one of the things this city hasn't been able to do yet, that particularly Palo Alto, is we could figure out a financing program for ADUs or accessory dwelling units, including, and that could be something that could be done on a local level. It could be done on as a community collective, a collection of cities. But it also could be, we could have a regional small dwelling unit finance program that could benefit business, but it could also benefit community. And that could be something that doesn't visibly densify, but provides a whole lot of units that meet our housing needs.
So Billy and I agree on a lot, but we disagree about incrementalism. Because I think, for two reasons. One is the example I gave before about Bill Reed's work, finding agreement across apparent disagreement. The other is that while things really often do need to happen in a step-by-step way, it really helps to know where we're trying to get to. So if you think about the US space program, we launched unmanned rockets. And then we launched rockets that had animals in them. And then we put something in orbit that was unmanned, and then it was in orbit with an animal, and then it was in orbit with a human, and then there was a lunar unmanned. But I mean, all this was in the context of President Kennedy saying in 1962 that we're going to land a man on the moon in 10 years and bring him back alive. With that arc, we took small steps. Very different than saying, oh, let's just take some small steps and see what happens. And I think that's an important difference.
I will just spar right back.
Yeah.
And that my personal instinct is never to be an incrementalist, but I would have stabbed out my eyes a couple times if I didn't choose.
Yeah.
So I think that, my active choice many times as a bridging practice to research to policy is being forced to choose incremental approaches as opposed to the home run, because I agree with you. I would much rather be the agitator, be the innovator, and be consistent with everything the Silicon Valley is about. But many times I think that's hard to do if we want consensus and
So going back to this idea from a few minutes ago of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and having empathy. The last few days I've been reading about the political campaigns to repeal the gas tax increase, notably in the context of Republican primary races. And it seems, when I read the arguments and the thought process, I find it hard to reconcile the underlying thought process. We don't want to do anything, or I'm obviously not sympathetic to them, or this is all crap, or we don't want to pay more taxes, with the underlying thought process of here, which is we all need to invest in various ways to achieve societally desirable goals. How do you reconcile that? Do you reconcile that?
Can you?
Can you? By the way, I will freely admit that I'm cynical.
What's the alternative?
By the way, I'm not disagreeing. I was caught in the middle of all the high-speed rail issues about you got to build it, but the high-speed rail authority's got its head up its you-know-what. Because they did it in the worst possible way to alienate their natural constituents.
My concern is this, if we think building the world we want is going to depend on cramming it down the throats of the people who disagree with us, I doubt we're going to get there. And if we get there, the pendulum's going to swing back and they're going to cram it down our throat, witness what's happening right now. You're not following what's happening at the EPA? I'm talking about national policy. I'm talking about EPA. I'm talking about dismantling 50 years of social progress.
Okay, now I understand.
Okay, so that's not an attempt to find a common agenda. That's to say, I'm going to muscle you out of the way. And if I've got enough muscle, I can do that. But if I don't have enough muscle, you're going to do it to me. And that's one way to live. And it maybe is the way that politics has to happen, but I suspect there are some other options. At least I'm seeing evidence in some places of some other options. Because, you know, call me naive, I think that there's a significant, to go back into national politics, I think there's a significant percentage of people who voted for Trump who could have voted for somebody else based on addressing the things that were motivating them and driving them into fear and often anger and hate.
That could lead to a whole discussion.
And it could, and it's just, and I don't know if I'm being Pollyannish or if I'm being really practical, because the other doesn't seem to work.
So from a taxation standpoint, I mean, it's a really interesting topic to bring up. I as well think it's, from a policy standpoint, gas tax is pretty essential to funding many things that we have in our state. And I don't know that there's an alternative policy being proposed, and I think that's the key answer. Mm-hmm. But I would say that no policy is perfect. And the idea that we could think about improving or enhancing or having an alternative policy that may function better long term, and I'll just throw out the BMT-based fees or BMT-based tax. I'm so sorry. These acronyms are so delicious. So if we were able to tax vehicles of all types or of some types based on the number of miles they traveled, so a vehicular miles traveled fee or a vehicle miles traveled tax, and why that's important for us to begin thinking about in general is that as we look at kind of those adoption curves that Gil was talking about, we do need to be prepared for a period where we consider the impacts for an all-electric fleet. And there still is a cost of providing streets and roads. There still is a cost of providing different transportation services. And how will we, when we drain ourselves of fossil fuels and we drain ourselves of that revenue source, how will we provide that level of funding? I think it's a fair question to ask.
And who will pay for them? Because
so we had a whole bunch of other people with questions, and it is 7:27, and there were a lot of hands. How many people would be okay, taking a few more questions till 7:40 or 7:45? Okay, cool. I think a significant number of people. Great. I'm going to take some more questions and then wrap it up. Gentleman in blue.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So my question is a little bit more pragmatic or practical than some of the theoretical questions that have been asked so far. So I was at a talk 6 months ago where someone said, oh, your Clipper card or whatever works, it's impossible for us to update it because it has to work across some ungodly number of agencies. And then I said, how could that possibly be right? The Bay Area isn't that big. And then I started counting them. And even me, who doesn't know that many of them, was able to count a lot of them. And so my question is, either from a historical point of view or just from a theoretical point of view, how is it that we've created so many different overlapping transit agencies that have to work with each other in order to provide effective commuting? Like, how did we get into that state? I'm not even asking how we can get out of it, I'm just asking how we can get into it.
So let me actually take that one, because this is something that Friends of Caltrain has been working on with other groups and really focusing on this. And there's actually a relevant decision coming up next week that we'll talk about in some of the calls to action. So when you look at things that are discombobulated, which they are, and the fact that there are about 28 public transit agencies, not counting the private ones, which there are, then the question is, well, why do we have so ungodly many? However, I was at a conference at UC Davis convened by the state of California about integrated travel just a week ago, and we had case studies presented by metropolitan transportation leaders in metropolitan areas, including Zurich, Switzerland, Nordic countries, Munich, and a number of other metropolitan areas. Zurich has 52 transit agencies. They have more than we do. Munich, I think it's 60. I need to look it up, but more than we do.
But they work.
And they work meticulously well with each other. And they have, so they have a coordinating agency that mandates cooperation. It's not consensus-based, it's not optional, it's mandated cooperation on fares and schedules and branding. And the public money that they depend on, they only get if they cooperate. And so there may be some strategies that we can do here in the Bay Area to take a page out of that book and to leverage our public funding to get cooperation, even if we don't have a big merger and acquisition activity, to make BART's union, take over from AC Transit's union.
I just add, maybe I'm going to steal your thunder from a call to action standpoint, but one of the things that we have developed these fiefdoms, and it is historically just based on different geographical competition and different job centers that have gradually grown into one another, and that's just how they've evolved. But we do have an opportunity with Regional Measure 3 coming up, that one of the key initiatives, and everyone should be aware that this is really important, is what they call Clipper 3.0, I believe. And so one of the key initiatives as part of Regional Measure 3 is to address this fare-based issue. And there are other working groups already underway to try to address this fragmentation issue, particularly in the Bay Area, but thinking about a single system from Sacramento to San Jose. So there are people having those discussions, and I say within I shouldn't put a timeline on it. So, but it will happen at some point. There's some economic pressure based on the transportation network companies and the long-term financial viability of these agencies, that they'll be incentivized to pool resources.
Whichever one of you that had a question, is it both? You're two different people, even though you're related.
It's me, but
okay, go ahead.
I wanted to get back to some of the stuff we started with like the climate action plans and the problem with transportation emissions not going down. How do we get it so that that the decisions made in local areas with housing do affect that? Also, my background is transportation planning too. One of the big issues with transportation is that it's individual decisions. So how do communities, so they can make the housing decisions, hopefully increase housing, increase density so that people live closer to at least where one partner works, but getting the decision making, combining the local decision making with the personal decision making, and making that all work.
So, if you don't mind, I'll start off, Gil. Nancy, that's a big question, so we'll have to take some of it offline, but I'd say two things is that, the first thing I think is essential, your CAP it has an environmental document, it is a city authorized document, but it is not a land use document. So the issue there is that there's going to be a lag of 5 to maybe even 10 years before that document gets filtered in. I used another acronym. Your climate action plan gets filtered into your state of California mandated general plan. And so we have a mandate every 5 years to revise 2 of our most important elements, pieces of our general plan, our housing element and our circulation element. There are 3 others that have to be revised every 5 years. And I think building those aspirational goals that are tied to climate reductions into that plan is really important, and they can justify some of what I talked about, which is tying your capital improvement goals, which in most cities in California are done on an annual basis, but tying those to very specific modal goals in your circulation element. And to that aspect, people on a planning commission or people on a city council then that see project by project things come in, they can say, how does this fit within our general plan? How does this actually consistent with our CAP document? And you do have that vertical alignment between documents. And I think that we're still not totally seeing that, and that's got to happen. And I think that's the #1 kind of land use planning thing and transportation planning thing that has to happen. But on the tail end, you talked about behavior, and this is where no one is doing a good job with post-occupancy validation and dealing with that. So we have an inordinate amounts of projects that come through every city in the Bay Area that say, we're going to do these transportation measures to do trip reduction. And we say we'll do post-occupancy validation. But what does that mean? That means that basically, the owner or a designee will send an email or a letter to the community development director or the planning director that says, well, here's what we did this year, or here's our goal. And that's even if they choose to check up on it. So that the idea of post-occupancy validation and documenting change over time, or even tweaking those transportation demand management strategies that are entitled with the project is completely not done, and it needs work.
So actually, this is an area where San Mateo, where you guys are from, is actually doing the best, because San Mateo does actually have post-occupancy required reporting, and they report on the transportation use of new developments to the Planning Commission and City Council annually. And they present this spreadsheet, which is the most boring thing on the planet Earth, except for the fact that it's revolutionary, because it does that. And this is something that I think a lot of us can learn from, because it's actually showing that accountability. I'm going to put.
So let me just respond to that, because the reporting, the problem is a developer is getting a loan on an entitlement that requires them a certain financial commitment to a process. And so if there's additional money that has to go to TDM, the question is reporting is one thing, taking action to address perhaps a project or people that are living in a project that are underperforming, that doesn't happen.
But what if a jurisdiction didn't say do TDM on top of what you're planning to do, but do TDM instead of parking spaces? We currently have parking minimums commonly as an entitlement condition. Mountain View in North Bayshore has parking maximums as an entitlement condition, has transit impacts as part of the entitlement process. Helsinki is doing parking maximums. So the kind of parameters we set for development is key. I think to your question, the other thing is oh God, two thoughts, and one of them left my brain. But one of the things we need to do is we need to remove the perverse subsidies that we have built into our processes. We have financial incentives to do the wrong thing. There, in theory, could be an environmental and an anti-tax coalition around those issues to say, let's remove those incentives, and then let's put the fees and charges for things on the people who benefit from them. So in other words, rather than, for example, everybody paying for parking spaces, what about the people who use parking spaces paying for parking spaces? That starts to send a signal in the marketplace that maybe drives behavior change.
Okay. And by the way, so they do collect money from these developments and have that run a TMA, whose goal is to tweak the transportation demand management if they need to do something else. Geraldine, and we need sorry, Adam and then Geraldine.
Okay, thank you to our speakers, and Palo, Alto, whoever made this possible. This is awesome, very energizing. My question is going to end up being similar to Nancy, so I appreciate Nancy's question, and I'll just try to get out of the way. But I do think we're having a discussion a little bit about how we might be able to get together something like a climate action plan, a general plan update, and other various pieces of what these cities here in the peninsula and beyond do together in the same room, so that we're working together. I think I just have another question about that and how to make that, how to get that started more or get it closer to happening than where it might be in some cities that maybe aren't as advanced as Palo Alto, although it sounded like even in Palo Alto we're still trying to get on the same page together. For example, in San Mateo we have a city council, we have a planning commission, and those two work on the general plan update. We have a sustainability commission that's now going to be merging with the Public Works Commission to be sort of a sustainability and infrastructure commission. It's very exciting, and there are going to be some opportunities to do some of what we've just been discussing here. But there are still going to be issues such as what Gil brought up, where we might ask a question about how housing is linked into certain transportation initiatives, and the answer might be, oh, that's not your domain, that the city council has to work on that, or so on. And so just some thoughts from both of you, especially from your experience on how to make inroads on that.
Okay. And then Geraldine is going to get the last question, and we're going to wrap it up with some calls to action. And the raffle.
Hi, I know we're out of time. I just have a specific question, Gil. It may be the wrong place to be asking, but the parking garages that are planned for this city in Palo Alto, what is the status on that? And is it too late to switch gears on those projects? It's been talked about, but anyway, I needed to ask.
Let me answer that, and then I want to come back to the other question there. The status is that they're moving forward. There have been delays. There are cost overruns that happen when things are delayed. These have become fairly expensive projects. Council is still committed to doing them.
But
there's some, you know, there's.
Can they be stopped? We don't need them, and they're just a big mistake.
I mean, I don't have purview over them, so to be clear about that. But like I said before, I'm a fundamentalist. You know, they don't exist yet.
Correct.
The concrete. No, hang on, Jerry. They don't exist yet. The concrete has not been poured yet. The sites have not been excavated yet. So, seems to me, in a very simple way, of course they could be stopped, if there was a commitment in the community to build a political will and a decision to stop them. If not, they're going to go forward. If they're, you know, and that's not what I can speak to. That's, you know, I'm not a voter here. You guys are. So it's a matter of your conversations with each other and your conversations with the council, and building the political perspective to find a better solution to the problem you're trying to solve. I mean, the irony of these is that, and this was stated in a staff report to council, David, back in January, I think, that said basically we're going to invest $75,000 per parking space to solve what is a 2 or 3 hour a day problem. Now, again, I don't have purview over that issue, but the way that I think about the world is that if I have a 3 hour problem, I probably don't want to solve it with a 24-hour solution. I probably want to solve it with a 3 hour solution. That's how my brain works. And I think there's a bunch of those in this case. So, you know, until these things are built, it's an open question. And so you need to be able to engage that question in a way that's, you know, that's productive and that takes into account the very real concerns that people have now. I mean, there are people who are unhappy. You know, Cal Ave, merchants are unhappy, people who come to lunch are unhappy. That has to be addressed. You can't just say, no parking garage. You have to say, here's a better way to meet your real needs.
Maybe they can
and only with that are you going to find a chip. Say what? What? I heard it.
Sorry, that was a Palo Alto joke.
What happened over here?
All right, Billy, do you have anything to add to that before we head into the wrap-up? Or should I
I'm getting punchy. Well, so the issue with parking is it just needs to be designed to transition, and that is like, so that should be a transitional use, and I think the structure is not being designed to transition, and it's going to cost more to do that. So that, but the bigger picture about how we reduce silos, I mean, I think that one thing that we can do is we can be present and try to break those down. We can encourage we don't have that many staff here from this city, but there's staff from other cities. I think staff, one of the ways when I was a practicing planner is that we chose to have informal working meetings where we actually workshop projects at the staff level between departments. And I think that, you know, as a planning director, that is something that you can choose to do. And as a city manager and a council, you can actually work to facilitate informal ad hoc working groups from a managerial strategy that actually can build some of those bridges before the things are aired out in public or aired out in a public meeting. But I don't view that as good planning. I view that as good management. And so I think that to a certain degree, this is actually about people and process. And if we can manage process better, then we can actually solve a lot of these issues in the public setting where we have like these silos and these fragmentations much better.
And on the subject of silo, kind of a wrap-up comment that is includes some personal opinion that doesn't is not an organizational position. But one of the things that you guys talked about really eloquently was about listening, common ground, consensus, empathy. But one of our structural problems is who's we? Because empathy is about having a sense of we. And when we have local decisions, for example, in a city council member can say, my accountability is to my voters in this city, and the fact that someone is commuting 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, doesn't get to see their kids. Well, they're not my constituent, and so it's not my responsibility. And therefore, that's why it seems to me that that sense of we needs to be beyond only the local, even though there are local motivations that help people too. And there's going to be, I think it needs to be a combination, because like with SB 87, we had many cities saying, I do not like this bill because land use is local. I want local control. And yet when we're talking about, well, how do we address commuting and the fact that jobs are far from transit and homes and services, then it's like, what can I do about it? This is a regional challenge. And I think to square that circle is going to involve some combination of the local, where those of us who see the problem and include in our sense of we, the people who are commuting from far away or do not live here yet and want some of the opportunities that we had, and also a larger convening at the regional and state level who have that sense of we that is a little bit larger. And so want to spend a couple of seconds talking about, well, what are some of the things that we can do? Several of these have been mentioned already. We talked about climate action plans going on in individual cities. We talked about parking garage decisions that seem to be at cross purposes with some of our climate goals. We talked about SB 1. Is there anybody who needs a little bit more briefing on SB 1 and what's happening in November about SB 1? Excellent, great. Senate Bill 1 was the gas tax, which has just recently used some funding for Caltrain full electrification, for express buses on Highway 101, upgrading BART cars that are falling apart, and other good sustainable transportation investments. But there's a call to repeal that in November. And so if you think that those are good investments, that is something that you might be interested in supporting. So that's one thing that is coming up. Any other really tactical things that are going on right now that people can participate in?
I think we would encourage you not to support the repeal. As a recipient of SB1 funds, as a researcher, I would definitely encourage you to not support the repeal of SB1.
Right, and hopefully my syntax on that was clear, that nobody was confused. Yeah, something people can do.
This involves some stuff with the regional measure 3. Some of the progressive groups in around the Bay Area are not supporting regional measure 3 because they feel that all that money that's collected should go to 100% transit. So there's again, kind of a home run attitude on that. But at the same time, RM3 provides further BART cars and a lot of I think Caltrain electrification is part of that one, and a bunch of other.
Barton Corridor, yeah.
So I guess if
right.
in action is there a way we can convince some of these progressive groups?
Right. Well, I think so that's a matter of participation. So that is something that's on the ballot in June. And, so you probably have this ballot now that you can vote on it. And, if someone really feels 100%, it does have some highways. So if you're like no highways at all, then do not vote for this. But if you think that, funding a lot of good sustainable transportation is like reasonable with your sense of compromise, go to greencaltrain.com. There's a blog post on it. I will give a push, and transformca.org with a little bit of analysis about it. The process that put that ballot measure together was very imperfect. And in terms of really having regional cooperation and having a really strategic goals of improving sustainable transportation so the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, it wasn't good enough. Friends of Caltrain thinks that the outcome is good enough. I'm going to vote for it, and we're endorsing it. Similar with Transform, but when we're looking at even larger investments going forward, we need a better process to be better on climate, better on sustainable transportation, and so on. Any other short-term
if I can
tactical
say, as an academic, I'm fully supportive of this bill just because it supports a multimodal framework, and that's, I think it's one thing that we're in an environment where we do have the power of choice, and it lies with each of us. But we also have to realize that even if we move to a non-fossil fuel-based economy, rubber tire solutions, whether or not they're buses or whether or not they're your own vehicle or a shared vehicle or an Uber or a Lyft, they are part of our total fleet right now. And to let roads flounder is actually that's not an appropriate choice either. So, I think this is the one policy that does balance things out. There's no such thing as a perfect policy, but it's been hammered out for a long time, and it includes a lot of transit projects, BART around the Bay, Clipper Universal Fare version 3, Caltrain electrification, a number of things that in places that don't have access right now. So we actually are transit rich compared to certain parts of the Bay Area. So I think there are really some opportunities here, and if that can nudge the needle, and if some of us can nudge the needle, that would be a great action.
I'm going to need to go and avail myself of transit right now, but let me just say one thing by way of closing. When we think about bills that are not perfect and coalitions that are really challenging to work with, Bernice Reagan, who's a folklore scholar at the Smithsonian Institution, some of you may know her as the founder of the singing group Sweet Honey in the Rock, said years ago, that if you're in a coalition and you're trying to get something done and you're not deeply uncomfortable all the time, your coalition's not big enough.
Nice job, Gil. Thank you. Looking forward to connecting again.
Thank you for putting this together. And thank you, Billy. Raffle and take it away.